A federal judge halted the Pentagon's policy of forcing journalists to be escorted inside its own headquarters, ruling it likely violated the First Amendment and was adopted in retaliation against the New York Times. Within weeks of each other, the Reuters Institute's digital news report delivered the most important number in journalism. The global trust in news is at 37%, the lowest since tracking began. Courts are expanding press access, while the public is abandoning the press anyway. When the system produces both headlines within the same month, something structural has broken. I'm Richard Schreiber. This is True Journalism. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Great to be with both of you gentlemen. The Fairness Doctrine governed licensed broadcasters. The FCC never had jurisdiction over digital platforms, however, and nobody closed that gap before social media and video networks became the most used route to news for 54% of global audiences. And the gentleman who helped build us into the future here with that infrastructure, CBS and Reuters TV, is with us today. It's quite an honor. And that was Edward R. Murrow's invitation: name the structural problem, then fix it. I'm Tom Martin, and as Richard said, this is True Journalism.
So our guest today, Barclay Palmer, was a founding senior producer at CNN, for Anderson Cooper 360, Amanpour, Newsnight 2.0. He played a senior role in creating and managing CBSN, CBS's streaming news channel, and he designed Reuters TV for Thomson Reuters. Now executive editor and head of business strategy at Climate and Capital Media, and a founder at Black Birch LLC. Peabody, Alfred I. DuPont, Columbia, Emmy, and Edward R. Murrow Award winner. Quite a list. Barclay, welcome to True Journalism. Great to have you.
Thank you both, Richard and Tom. It's good to be with you.
You are founding senior producer at CNN's digital flagship shows, and then you helped build, as I mentioned, CBSN and Reuters TV. But when you were building those platforms, what were the problems you were trying to solve? And is that still the right problem really today?
Yes, is the shortest answer.
Sorry, no yes or no questions.
Oh, okay. When they set up Anderson Cooper's 360 as the definitive be-all and end-all 2-hour live show, 10 to midnight, and Jonathan Klein essentially gave that show license to direct the network on many levels: direct coverage, direct style, etc. And I had been on Aaron Brown's show, and then there was a very brief overlap, which was permanent, but I knew it wouldn't last, and it lasted only 6 weeks. And so when Anderson's team was pulled together, I just took my laptops upstairs and asked if I could help out. And I'd done a lot of work with the reporting teams over the years, both as a producer all over the country and a lot of disasters, but also as executive producer in the New York or Northeast Bureau, directing day of air coverage. And in that period, as executive producer, that is when CNN recognized it needed a little more producing, a little more showbiz appeal to expand its audience. That the news was the star, but the news had to be a little more dynamic and a little more interesting. And so they brought in a bunch of very accomplished people from ABC and elsewhere. And so I transitioned to the shows because that's where the action and the decision-making power was. But the other thing that was happening at the same time was the emergence of digital as an important platform or series of platforms. And one of the things that was an advantage of being with Anderson's show, and it was an amazing team, just a tremendous team, privileged to work with all of them, and was that it was no longer about just sitting down and watching TV. As Jonathan Klein and various consultants told us, it was people were on their phones and on their laptops and they were just talking. And so we were given the guidance and we recognized that it was important in order to build your ratings on TV, you also needed to engage digitally. Obviously, it's obvious now. By the time the evidence was emerging, and we developed a special website and social media platforms, and I actually helped build AndersonCooper360.com as a kind of an op-ed site where we would get some of the key voices on the campaigns or on the news to blog for us before, during, and after appearing, so that there was this sort of constant flow on our platforms. But also I was given the green light to build these partnerships. For example, we were one of the first VIP partners, news partners with Facebook, for example, and Real Clear Politics and Daily Beast and so on. And this seemed very smart and opportunistic, and it was good to engage with these digital leaders because that's where the growth was. It didn't make everyone in Atlanta at CNN Digital happy for understandable reasons. There was some pushback, and that's putting it mildly, about giving our content away, despite essentially explaining we're just giving a taste of it with links to try to pull people in. And so these different techniques of working with these outside partners, of doing our own digital and our own social, were all an attempt to build our ratings. And it was interesting because, first of all, I learned a huge amount. We all learned a huge amount, and it was quite successful in the sense that beforehand, ideas were feeding into the conversation, and afterwards, we would feed in highlights and key points into digital, and that would help bring people back to the show. It's actually, I won't forget, one of the leaders in CNN who's still there saying essentially that effort failed because it didn't really substantially build ratings. And what's interesting about that is it's all in how you think of it. You could argue that, yeah, it didn't build TV ratings significantly. On the other hand, without it, our ratings might have gone down, which happened subsequently.
Yeah.
And also, on some level, it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether TV ratings went up or down per se, because you had to be on social platforms. You had to make an impact. And so that conversation too was challenging, but also indicative. And so a couple of former CNN leaders had recruited me over to go to Thomson Reuters when the Canadian business data and media and journalism company, Thomson, had bought the British business data and media company, Reuters, and headquartered in New York for the first time because Bloomberg was clobbering them in terms of business take-up and sales and revenue. And so, yeah, I created something that I called Reuters TV and designed a bunch of shows with input from some really smart people over there, really wonderful, fascinating people. And that too, there was a certain amount of friction because it was different for Thomson and it was different for Reuters and it was different for text journalists. A lot of the best minds were really into it. We had a lot of fun, a lot of great insight. But you had some of the people who were on the business data side at Thomson, understandably saying, I had gotten $2 million out of Google and YouTube, become one of their first journalism partners. And we went from 0 to 1.7 million unique viewers per month in 10 months, which is really unusual. And yet we had, I remember a senior executive at Thomson saying, what are we doing with this cat video YouTube channel? Why would we partner with them? So
It can't possibly be a future for
for future to that. And of course, YouTube just completely collapsed. Nobody wanted to pay any attention anymore.
Because that's what it was in its infancy. Kind of music videos, cat videos, people doing silly dances. That's what it was.
But I will say one of the things that was really a privilege, and I was lucky to be able to do this, was being on the sort of the front edge of a lot of these innovations, which were controversial and sometimes successful in ways that didn't necessarily immediately meet the eye if you're looking through a traditional lens. But for example, in New York, literally, I remember calling business people up and saying, I'm from Thomson Reuters and I'm working with Felix Salmon, for example, and we want to do this sort of an interview with you. And the Reuters, you mean Roto-Rooter, the plumbing company?
Oh, no. Yeah.
Before Reuters came out from behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Now people know, but at the time they didn't. And so there are just all these different doors opening and people getting bumped in the back of the butt by the doors as well. So the challenges, to answer your question, were how do you build a business and a global profile with all these different levers? And could you make them work together? And did they even really work? And the answer is yes and no, of course.
Well,
and so we did help. And I actually am very grateful to the then CEO and the then editor-in-chief, who's now, I think, CEO at Reuters, for facilitating this, for allowing us to experiment. And we did help build a profile in New York and then globally for this. The Reuters TV at the time was the first direct to consumer play. Now they have them, we developed them, and there are different versions of Reuters TV now, but there hadn't really been at the time. Did that succeed? Yes, but it's always a challenge. And media has been just going through journalism has been going through such a challenge on a business case. And I've been actually working on it with a very innovative platform called Distributed Media Lab, which is a whole other conversation. It'd be really worth getting into to try to help local journalism outlets across the US primarily to share content, share revenue, and thereby build revenue and reach. Media has been messy, creative. It's been very challenged, and I've been lucky to be part of it.
Yeah. What you built at Reuters TV now has really positioned that combination of digital media such that over half of the people today get their news around the world through those sources, no longer through cable and over-the-air TV. So the collaboration definitely did result in that change of direction. And I guess one could say it seeded something very important, but it's also, as we've subsequently become aware of all the deepfakes and the AI animated fake news and other things, it's also created some challenges across the spectrum.
Absolutely. The AI, deepfakes, also just completely alternative universes of reporting of truth and social and truth social. It's getting very challenging.
We're not name dropping here.
No, it's very challenging to know what's true. And you also have a population that hasn't always wanted to engage, hasn't always wanted to take the time to read or to weigh different sources of information. And, one of the ironies of journalism and storytelling, of course, is that conflict is appealing and attractive.
Yes.
And that has been reflected in this tendency toward splintering of truth and journalism to reflect one point of view or another. And then you don't know what's true. People don't know what's true. And then you get into the sort of tribal loyalty of I'm for this side and I'm for that side without that independent sifting of the evidence, which is what journalism is really designed for. Yeah. But our current social media doesn't really facilitate.
Yeah, and
business model doesn't support.
But they talk about the distinction between facts and truth. I remember when Kellyanne Conway tried to say that there are alternative facts, which of course is a contradiction of terms, but there are alternative truths because what we believe and what are our values, bias, and truths, our values, bias, and beliefs become those truths.
Yeah, I think there's another phenomenon, which is that the world, social platforms have brought so much of the world to us. There's so much of it. There's just an overabundance on every platform of all kinds of different people and topics. And it's become harder for people to sift through that. And so a lot of people just don't, and they pick sides, and then they don't sift. And so you have this odd phenomenon where people don't believe the media, as you alluded to in the beginning. They don't necessarily even see differences between different journalism platforms, or they don't pay any attention to them at all. So you have this paradoxical or ironic dumbing down of the media, not of journalism per se, not of good journalism, and the public. And it's a real conundrum because the business model keeps supporting all this division and this splintering of
the eyes and the ratings. Tom?
Yeah, no, you touched on so many important points there. It's funny. It's like I think of my own background. I think we were at CNN, or I was at CNN Financial News while you were at CNN there. And I'd gotten my start at CBS News a few years earlier when Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite was vacating the chair for Dan Rather. And so on some of these episodes, Richard and I have talked a lot about what's happening at CBS News. And so it's very easy, just like there's polarization politically and in how people think and act these days, there's polarization about topics like that. But you're an excellent person to ask about. Sounds like a lot of what you just described is the evolution of the audience. What does the audience want? What are their viewing? What are their habits for taking in news? And we would, I'm sure all three of us would like to think that the people in charge have a sense of civic responsibility. Just Walter Cronkite said, let me show you, we'll give you the world in 22 minutes. What's going on in the police in Africa, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Or that you know these things, that kind of thing. Is that kind of like a paternalistic attitude? I don't know. But I see, again, I left CBS News some years ago. I also spent time at ABC News. But I just get concerned that maybe, and again, part of this, while I was there at CBS News, Larry Tisch came in, owner of Lowe's Hotels. So does he have a strong sense of responsibility? Having balanced these things, and CNN is still my number one go-to source for the news. Spend hours on it every day. I have enormous respect for Anderson Cooper and Christiane Amanpour and many of their people, Dana Bash, and I could go on and on. But can you tell us more about how you balance, or if you can balance, that sense of civic responsibility? Maybe either you have it or you don't have it, but changes are underway. And when I try to say, is there anything positive I can say about the new owners of CBS News and Paramount and so on, it's maybe change is inevitable. You talked about change there at CNN and so on. What are your thoughts about all that?
I do think that there are these arcs in culture and society and history. And I think one of them that is not necessarily seen immediately is that in the wake of World War I and then World War II, there was this idea that we had done good and we were going to use our power to do good. And that was infused in our politics and our military, but also our journalism and our civic society and so on. And I think that a challenge that we have now is this splintering of the world, of world power, and of that idea of being a force for good. And you have a much more transactional administration, Congress, business community, and on one level you can understand that because everyone wants to make a buck and they want to succeed. But there has been a bit of a fading of that sense of value in making a positive impact in the world, and therefore growing conflict over whether and how and all that. And we're seeing that in media. You've got people who are expressing their opinion, and it's my opinion, and we love his opinion or her opinion, or their view against all the other views. And the idea of coming around, Tom Brokaw talked about the greatest generation, of coming around for a globally worthwhile community or effort has faded. And I think that's just happened across the board. And then if you think back, why is it fading? It's been a while since we've had something that pulled us all together like that. What would bring it back together? What, another global conflict? The flip side of that coin is a little bit tricky. One thing that it's ironic, and not to shift lanes, but I remember over my 21 years at CNN and then at CBS, and so on, we're all looking at what is the big story? What is really happening here that people aren't taking in, that they need to know, we should be reporting on for public benefit? And it's also complex, and there's so much going on. And now I'm in the sort of climate and capital media space, and realizing that on some level, what's going on at these sort of national and international levels is oversimplified. And what's Iran war on, or is it off? It goes way deeper than that, and the effects are going to go so much deeper than that.
Yes.
And it's harder for people to want to take that in, to have the time to take that in.
We all have shorter, thanks to the cat videos, we have shorter attention spans now. Like, as to what's going on there, I can't digest this.
You got about 5 seconds to keep the audience going.
If that, talk with a guy who says it's 2.5 seconds. Actually, a former CNNer, lovely guy, who runs the China Global South Project.
Yeah. One of the things. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that when you look at sort of climate, it's like the Don't Look Up, that film, it's a big enough story. Yeah. And I've talked with the former CNNers who are running This Week and NBC Nightly, and they say every time we do anything climate related, the ratings go down. I've seen that. And Anderson Cooper, we had, and they probably still do, minute-to-minute ratings, and you could see any international story, any war story, down. Wow. And if you're running a business, that's meaningful. And so, do they really want to do a climate story now? Maybe not. But it is, there's, the air is worse. Are we going to talk about it?
I think Al Gore had it right. It is the inconvenient truth that nobody wants to talk about. And I
Yeah.
remember 60 Minutes did a piece in 2022 at the tail end with a bunch of scientists that said, if we don't do something about climate control today, our species will be extinct in 40 years.
Yeah.
Not 100, not 150, 40 years.
Yeah.
And,
Go ahead. Sorry.
and which is frightening.
Yeah. On the other hand, in every dark scenario, there's an opportunity, right? And the opportunity is, hey, we actually have a lot of technologies that can fix the planet, that can fix our air, that can clean it up. Do we have are there interests that are holding us back on that? Yes. Do we have the political aware or motivation to do anything about it? And that's complex.
Yes.
Exactly what is not appealing on the social media platform. A lot of what I do is try to identify these risks, but also the opportunities, and to make it palatable for people to say, oh, I could do this. I could do that.
That's
I
great.
can do things and make an impact.
Very interesting.
I think I like the reporting. I don't know how many years he's been there at CNN, but I like the environmental reporting of Bill Weir. I don't think he's on that often, but I think he's a great journalist. And I think a year or two ago, he came out with a book, 100 Positive. People are tired of the negative, that,
Yeah.
you point there. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing now, actually.
So, who among us can forget follow the money, the Watergate? Yes. And so one of the things that climate capital media that we do is follow the money and the policy that fosters that money. And so a few years ago, with Biden in office and the Democrats, who had great momentum behind renewables and taking action to try to reduce the pollution in the air, the water, et cetera. Of course, that's gone by the wayside. But if you follow the money outside of what U.S. policy is fostering, there's a huge global movement in this direction. It's sort of slow and it's very detailed. It's all over the world, and a lot of it's in China.
Yeah.
But people are moving in that direction. And one compelling reason to follow the money is if you have any interest in making any money, then, or preserving your capital, then you have an interest in this. What some of the reporting we've done, for example, is that banks, both public and private, central banks, have used models, financial models for climate impact that underestimate climate impact. Why? One reason is they forget about, or they don't factor in the cascading impacts. If this happens, then this happens, and this happens, which is ironic because it's like bankers forgetting the principle of compound interest.
Yeah.
How can you forget that? But if you're looking for what will be in demand or what will make money over time, what will be a good investment, a lot of it is the renewables, it's the transition technologies, it's the risk reduction, and there's a lot of money flowing in there. It's fascinating.
But one of my favorite TV shows is Taylor Sheridan's show called Landman, which is a really interesting expose, obviously, on the oil industry. But, and of course, fossil fuel has been lionized as one of the real problems with pollution. But what we don't realize is fossil fuel isn't going anywhere because it is the number one main ingredient, petroleum, in plastics. And our entire economy is steeped in plastics. So while the oil companies we may diminish through electric cars and other means, and wind and all these other alternative technologies, that the oil industry are quick to remind us that putting up a wind farm probably uses more electricity and contributes more to global warming than if you were just simply perpetuating an oil generator to produce the same amount of electricity. So to your point, very nuanced space.
Of course, that's a totally misleading example because you're talking anything you build new is going to take a lot.
It's going to take a lot.
Anything you just maintain is going to take less. So, but
Yeah.
the question is, what's the impact?
What is the impact over 30 years versus the comparative analysis? Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out for him. So,
But it's an important example because that is part of the dialogue. But you have to get under what people say to see what's really true. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go.
Yeah, no, that was the point, that things are not always what they appear to be, and follow the money from the Tom Cruise movie, which was coming on the heels of Watergate, which were both really influential aspects of our lives, Tom and I growing up. One of the things that Tom and I often talk about, and you alluded to this before, is this dichotomy of information and how it's processed. And even though Tom and I have observed, certainly through what's happened with Barry Weiss at CBS and the acquisition by the Ellisons of two large media empires, is the First Amendment aspects of the news media now coming under attack. When
Yeah.
Scott Pelley famously gave his example where Barry Weiss tried to get him to tell modify the story about the two folks that were unfortunately killed in Minnesota by ICE, to try to say that the woman driver in the van did steer her vehicle in the direction of the officer who shot him, which after Scott Pelley watched the videos repeatedly said just wasn't the case. And he, to his credit, he never modified the story, but that was a cautionary tale of apparently what is to follow. And that's a big concern. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and how we reverse it. It's not that administrations in the past have not tried to control the media, influence the media. We know that Richard Nixon tried to sue the New York Times from preventing information from coming out, and he lost 6-3 in court.
Yes, your point. And actually, I didn't finish the other point I was making about it. The golden age of doing well for the world is also a golden age for journalism. And now we have a very splintered media that is for telling one side's truth or the other side's truth, and you have fewer reporters and journalism organizations that are trying to tell a more objective truth. And people argue there's no such thing as objective, maybe, but there are such things as facts. And so I think the challenge is people who have an interest will try to push that interest regardless of the facts. And a lot of that comes down to money and power. And so when money and power dominate, those agendas dominate, and we're seeing a lot of that now. There are certain times in history when I think people's desire for the truth becomes more forceful. And we've had this sort of golden age of journalism that's fraying a bit now because the business model doesn't support it. And I think a key question is, at some point, will people say, I want to know what's actually true? I don't want to keep hearing this or keep spouting these sort of talking points from vested interests. It's a harder period of time for them. Just the number of journalists from, you could call it mainstream media, but media that's trying not to be partisan has declined by something like 25 or 30%, 50% in a generation. And that's shocking. So I think it's a challenging era, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then one of the things, and I'll throw the baton back to Tom, is that watching news, and we had someone on who worked with Roger Ailes, and she said when he came into Fox News, he made it more entertainment-like. Yes, they hired attractive anchors. They tried to invoke more of the entertainment aspects of it. And all of that, when it started out, was fun, until obviously the migration into the partisan, and now some folks call it propaganda, where they're just simply passing incorrect news or exaggerations, falsifications in support of one political party. And then MSNBC, on the other hand, or MS Now, is, I don't know if you would call what they have as propaganda, but most of what they report seems to have a particular slant to it. And again, to your earlier point, follow the money.
Right.
If they were simply reporting the facts in a neutral fashion and let the facts speak for themselves, which is what true journalism is about, the people decide. Just report the facts. But MSNBC, as you indicated, in order to keep the eyeballs and the ratings and the money coming through the coffers, has chosen to go in its own direction to continue to keep people at odds against one another and sensationalize aspects and so forth. So we're kind of in a zero-sum game right now.
Yeah, and Fox News is doing the same thing on the other side, and all the other conservative media outlets. One sort of irony is that the terms liberal and conservative don't really apply properly anymore. Conservative once meant keeping the structures of society intact and keeping your budgets, your spending within budgets and so on. And
Fiscally responsible.
That's just not part of the dialogue anymore. Yeah. It's a challenging time. And given the low barrier to entry, combined with media, any sort of social post, we can all do it, it's for free. And given the fact that conflict or taking a point of view or fostering anger tends to get more attention, those two phenomena are combining to make it harder to make a business out of more objective reporting or showing both sides, trying to keep the opinion out of it. That's a very challenging time. But then the question is, will that last, or will there be a certain point at which people say, enough, whether en masse or in more specific areas? Just for example, the whole current debate over policy, I remember a lot of the opposition to Biden and the Democrats was inflation. And a lot of that was fostered because the Federal Reserve and the government threw billions of dollars into the economy to make up for the lost GDP from COVID, right? Just like massive amounts of money. Of course, you can have inflation and just throw massive amounts of money at something, but now inflation isn't exactly going down. So are people going to draw a line at some point, or are we at a point where it's so tribal that people aren't going to pay attention to that anyway? And they're just going to be angry and stick with what they want.
Yeah, so true. And people are angry, and now it's
so I think that in terms of the name of the show, True Journalism, like whether you're an individual or a business, if you can try to convey actual facts, then there's some service there, even though sometimes it feels like we're in a little rowboat, our own little oar.
And the speedboats are passing us.
Yeah, like you said a minute ago, speculating when will people reach the point like we've had enough. I'd love to hear more about your work with Christiane Amanpour and Anderson Cooper, journalists who I respect on that top echelon in terms of integrity and trust. I remember, I don't know if this is just my own opinion, it's not criticism at all, but I remember my mom was born and raised in New Orleans, and so that we have roots back in New Orleans. I remember when Anderson Cooper was covering Hurricane Katrina, and I think he was speaking out about how things needed to be done here as well. He's stepping over that line. He's not just a journalist. He's an advocate, taking on a little advocacy role here, and I like that. Now, of course, we get a lot of that everywhere, but love to hear what it was like to work with those two great journalists, because maybe we need people like that and more people like that to wake people up. Like we need to throw the ball back to the public if they're going to have fragmented attention spans and be so polarized they don't even see conflicting facts. We're at a loss. I don't know. I'm just curious your thoughts about all that.
Great privilege to work with both of them. They're both amazing human beings. I worked with Anderson first, and I think Anderson is an interestingly kind of complex person. He's on television, he's famous, he's well known, he's also a bit introverted. And although that may be partly because he grew up with so much fame around him, you have to have your own life on some level. But Anderson, interestingly, has both a clear moral compass and a sense of what's right or not, and that's partly what made him famous. To his credit, you could argue against it, but to his credit, he also has a sense of what is commercially viable. And so he will pay attention to what people want to see and whether something will attract eyeballs and how to get at that. And that's a kind of a commercial instinct that has served him well and CNN well, and rightly. Christiane is a true blue journalist to the core, and I hope it's fair to say, pays a little bit less attention to that, and to her credit, and will sometimes get into topics and conversations and points that aren't as popular. And sometimes people get all upset at things she says, and sometimes she can be quite vocal in ways that a lot of people aren't. And some people get upset with her for some things she says. On the other hand, you can't get the passion to take up these topics and ask these hard questions and to dig down deeper into the topic and the story beyond what everyone is saying if you don't have that kind of passion drive. Right. So it goes hand in glove a little bit. And it's almost a cliche, like some of the best journalists get in trouble sometimes because they're doing their jobs well.
Yeah.
Or because they may step on or cross slightly a line. And she's acknowledged those. But unless you get to that line, you're not really doing anything. And how many hours and networks and shows and anchors do we see who are just doing a kind of a milk toasty talking about what is perceived as the news without actually revealing anything below the surface.
Yeah. Most happy. Maybe this is not exactly journalism, but I was happy, again, being a CNN junkie, as I said. I was happy that they did a live broadcast of George Clooney and Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah.
Broadway. I had not seen it. I have not even seen it, to be honest with you, but I just thought the conflict that they illustrated between Edward R. Murrow and William Paley about the commercial interest and what's right about what's wrong in society right now, I thought was really quite excellent. I'm glad that they showed that play.
Yeah. To your point, Edward R. Murrow is lionized now, but he also had people insisting that Paley fire him constantly. And you just don't, the kinds of truths that he revealed in some ways for the first time were really uncomfortable or inconvenient. And so it's a loss when you don't have that. And we don't have a lot of that. So the extent to which Christiane is still providing that and some others out there are doing it, and enormously valuable.
Yes.
So,
And we don't have reporters who necessarily hold the administration accountable. Like Tom and I grew up, Sam Donaldson, but Mr. President, or Dan Rather, two White House correspondents who would hold the presidents. But there was respect. There was still an element of respect and decency. Today, that's all out the window, especially in the current administration. And Tom and I have talked very specifically about how there's been in effect, an attack on women reporters, particularly in the White House press scenario, which deeply troubles us. And it used to be, if that happened, other members of the press would kind of step in and ask follow-up questions to try to kind of dissolve some of the rancor. But today that no longer happens. If a journalist asks a difficult question of an administrative official or the president, they're pretty much left to their own devices. And whatever crossfire happens, they're kind of left out on the open.
yeah. And to be fair, that's partly because it's a tougher environment. The decorum that would prevent retaliation is lost, right? It's funny you mentioned Sam Donaldson. It wasn't his nickname like Helicopter Sam? Because he was, question.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. The back of the room. Yeah.
Or just from the president approaching the helicopter when there's massive amounts of noise, but he had the projection to be heard anyway. And of course, he asked the question and it was on tape. So the president ignored it, then that's what you saw.
That's right.
Was it ignoring the question?
That's right.
Yeah, it's a tougher scenario now.
Yes.
Well, I'm sure we could talk at great length. I don't know if you have another question, Richard, but I could just say we're honored you could join us.
Oh, very much, Barclay.
Want to make sure having people follow the journalism the work that you're doing right now about the climate and so on.
There's so much fascinating reporting going on about climate and public health, pesticides, but also business opportunity, innovation, technology, who's picking up the money. If anyone wants to pull the thread, just on any social platform, on any journalism platform, not any, but a lot of them, there's just so much going on that's completely fascinating. And on some level, not to diverge, but on the climate level, we're seeing essentially this battle between vested interests and not just people, but businesses that actually want to have a market to sell into. They want to have a healthy public and they want to have a good reputation. So even within the business community, there's this great tension. And then really, to your point about plastics, it's a known strategy of the fossil fuel industry to make us all dependent on plastics. But then you have companies like Blue Land, for example, which are overtly taking action against plastics and trying that there are a bunch of companies, people, the MAHA movement is trying to address pesticides and plastics. So there are people on the ground level who are responding to that. The question is, how will this play out? And sometimes the darkest scenario, I think, is like a Mad Max world of, oh my God, we failed to stop growing desertification around the world. And now you just are fighting for survival. Or actually, innovation will take hold. And just as we solved the ozone layer problem, maybe we will solve a lot of these other problems because the business case is there, public health is there.
And one final note on that, I know there was a documentary several years back on climate control. I think Sean Penn may have narrated it, but it talked about a lot of the innovations coming from Scandinavia, from Europe, from other parts of the world. So even if America is doing things like the Supreme Court voting that Monsanto's Roundup can still be distributed at will, in spite of the fact it causes cancer and kills people, obviously some of the capitalistic pursuits in America sometimes butt up against some of these things that we need to do to sustain us as a species. Fortunately, the rest of the world doesn't quite appear that same way. And there's a lot of innovation, as you mentioned. There's plenty in America, too, thanks to people like yourself.
Absolutely. Lots going on behind the
Yes.
scenes.
Going behind the scenes. Because, every year in New York, we have Climate Week. And I actually love to go to that because I love to talk to forward-thinking people and really understand what's happening around the world, in Brazil and different places where climate control is top of mind. So it perpetuates. So we're grateful for the work that you do in that space.
Oh, thank you. I'm grateful for yours. Will we as a species figure it out and be healthy?
I think it's inevitable. We are survivors. So we'll
Yes.
figure it out.
One way or the other.
All right.
Mad Matt.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Barclay. So
Yeah.
we usually close things out, as I mentioned earlier, with a handful of news stories during the week that we identify what are the facts and then what some of the spin that's happening. We already talked about the Pentagon press escort rule that was halted in federal court. Unescorted access allows journalists to observe sensitive activity patterns that lead to unauthorized disclosures, was the Pentagon's take on that. But Judge Friedman ruled that the escort policy, again, likely violates the First Amendment because it was adopted in apparent retaliation against the New York Times, who asked some difficult questions that didn't want to be answered or revealed some newsworthy information that didn't quite sit well. But it's not a general right of press access in government buildings that law can prevent.
And then you had on the other side, the Supreme Court in that sort of emergency decision without any written opinion following it, essentially upholding a court judgment against a reporter for not revealing her sources. Does that come down to First Amendment or not? Are we protecting the First Amendment or not?
When I went to journalism school, it was, but I guess not. Tom?
Yeah. And again, as you also mentioned earlier, Richard, and this certainly bothers me, trust in the news media is at a new low, 37% of the public. And again, on our episodes here of this podcast, we often talk about deepfakes and so on. And this is maybe a trivial example compared to the fate of our planet. But the other day I noticed, hey, did you know that Paul McCartney performed Taylor Swift's wedding at Madison Square Garden? I said, that sounds like a perfect example. Richard and I talk about this. Take one celebrity, another celebrity, something that everybody's talking about, and just throw it out there. And there's no way to
verify it.
Sync everybody's cameras. It's like an interesting kind of perfect storm of did it really happen? And it turned out, yes, it actually happened. But it tells you where we are in terms of what's on social media and so on. So we need to work.
And trust in the news on social media is even lower than that 37%. It's 22%. If it's 22%, why do 54% of the people actually watch it? That's a contradiction in some ways.
Yeah. And who do the other 70% actually trust? And are those folks trustworthy?
Exactly.
Very concerned.
But the next news item was the 250th anniversary speech that the president gave very late. Unfortunately, literally, the rains rained on his parade. Trump called this July 4th milestone one of the most joyous and glorious milestones of all time, the golden age or the golden dawn of America. And then conceived in Providence, born of the blood of heroes, and then talked about the influx of communism and why that's still a specter. And the speech was almost, to many of us, came out of Mein Kampf. CNBC and the Washington Post documented a campaign-style speech that repeated calls for new voting restrictions and warnings about communists departing from the traditional unifying types of speeches you expect at a holiday of this consequence. Tom?
Yes. And again, as we're just getting at, it says deepfake detection is at a chance level. A study found as good as a coin toss, us humans can detect whether it's real or not. And I see this surfacing. Again, I got my start covering the political news beat, CBS News in Washington years ago. So I'm very interested in what's being put out during these primary campaigns and so on. And it is hard to tell.
Sure. And then an interesting story of this week where the Supreme Court actually allowed the state of Texas, the Texas App Store Act, which the tech industry tried to characterize as being unconstitutional censorship that will harm innovation and suppress free expression. Justice Alito declined to block this law, which would have required app stores to verify users' ages and obtain parental consent for minors downloading these apps and purchases while the litigation continues. So obviously a very controversial area. We saw that Australia passed a global law against anyone under the age of 16 from having social media accounts. Obviously, a lot of controversy around that and deep feelings for those of us who are parents. Tom?
Yeah, no, and Richard, you'd mentioned Barry Weiss earlier and what's going on at CBS News, Skydance, and so on. And one of perhaps my favorite show that I worked for in my scattered career was CBS Sunday Morning with Charles Kuralt and a little bit with Charles Osgood. And so I'm still a loyal viewer. This past week, they had David Martin, the Pentagon correspondent with CBS News, did a story about the Stars and Stripes military newspaper and how they're being pressured. Certain things are too woke and so on. And I have to give CBS News credit, or someone credit, maybe Rand Morrison, the executive producer, and David Martin, for putting that story on the air, for pushing a little bit, because that's the kind of thing. What's happened to CBS, we would never see anything like that. So I give them a lot of credit. And Ted Koppel is doing a nice job on Sunday Morning also.
Yeah, I know the Pantheon certainly remembering the Iran hostage crisis, which spawned. Yeah, what a great thing. Here's another interesting story about a Democrat, Plattner, who allegations against him of improper conduct, sexual conduct, ended up ultimately ending his campaign. The campaign called the allegations categorically false and politically motivated. But yet, because of pressure from his own party, he ultimately ended up resigning, including Bernie Sanders and other Democratic leaders that asked him to step aside. We don't want to ask the obvious question, and that if there was a Republican, would the same thing happen? But I'd like to think that it would. The bottom line is an inappropriate candidate should not be running for office.
But then the problem also is it's an upsetting, the classic political story. What's true? We don't know. There isn't time to figure it out. It's too late in the game. Why is it coming in now? Is there actually a reason for that we should know, but don't? Or not really?
He says the timing, and like I said, we don't know exactly.
But yeah, it's an unfortunate, though classic mess.
And with the balance between the two parties in the Senate and the House right now, so razor thin, it's more important than ever, stories like that.
And to your point, Barclay, I remember when Al Frankel, who was a Democrat, was forced to step down by his own party, and subsequently the allegations proved to be false. So yeah, you're spot on. It's like sometimes we don't even wait for the truth. News can play judge, jury, and sentencing all in one fell swoop.
I do. Although you're quite right. What is the truth here? I do think it's worth noting that, again, some New York Times journalists and CNN journalists, including Jake Tapper, dug in. They could say, oh my God, this might prevent the Democrats from getting that Senate seat in Maine. But that didn't stop them from digging a little bit deeper. So we give them credit for that. And along the same lines of what's true, it's fine. I'm getting into the World Cup spirit. I went to my World Cup game the other night, Argentina versus Cape Verde. And so Donald Trump, he said that it restraining himself from stepping into things, as we know, that he just said, no, I think that red card should be revoked. It's like, what the heck is going on here? People were analyzing the video and so on. I think the bottom line, and again, I read different sports columnists and so on at the editorial saying there's a purpose of those referees. We've agreed that would be the way we resolve these things. Whether I'm just a fan, I'm looking at the video, I don't see it. But we agreed at the Supreme Court, we agreed that it would be resolved in this way. And so maybe we should see it through. It turned out to be relevant. USA lost, unfortunately. But
yes, for an loser.
Is that the Supreme Court that respects precedent, or the one that doesn't?
I know. That's a good point. We're getting a couple verdicts here and there.
And the ironic thing is that this kind of thing had happened in the past with FIFA or similar scenarios, but most of the things that took place were behind closed doors. because the president is so transparent in what he does, he actually shined a light on some of the mechanisms inside of FIFA that really need to be looked at.
Exactly.
Good point.
Back to you, Richard.
All righty. So, Barclay, you built delivery systems that most Americans get their news on still today that work, and this work, asking why those systems are no longer trusted, aren't in conflict. They're the same job, separated now by a decade. We want to thank you both. Both of us want to thank you for being here and sharing this time with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, we often again talk about the fairness doctrine, and so that was in the age of broadcasting when there were some limitations and scarcity in terms of time and what could be presented, and digital platforms were never licensed under the fairness doctrine, and now that's in part producing a 37% trust number that we talked about a moment ago, and so that still remains a problem. The structure doesn't automatically produce accountability. And we talked about those gray areas. This was really a stimulating conversation. I'm very grateful. I guess someone has to build that architecture deliberately, any way to do it. And I also keep thinking the ball is getting tossed back to the public, that we need to just discern what we're taking in, make more of an effort to gather the information. So I think the ball is being tossed to the public here.
And will the public pick it up and do something useful with it? Or just be angry?
I hope so.
And
It's the
which,
following.
which leads to our close, Barclay. I'd love to get your quick thoughts on this. I don't want to take more of your time, but what should the average consumer of news, what should they really look for? Should they take the time to look for the truth, check the source, and do a little more homework?
Absolutely. But that said, people want to do homework. People are very busy. Many of us are just trying to get through the day. But yeah, a little skepticism about all sides, including the side we might agree with, and looking for facts rather than just opinion. People, I think, lost track of a little bit of the difference. But also, and this sort of speaks to the climate thing, people can make an impact if they get involved. There's a fellow named John Raskin of the Spring Street Climate Fund who says that every email or call to policymaker has much greater impact than one voice, because they assume that if one person is reaching out, there are probably a few hundred that care about it. And so I think there's a tendency to feel like we can't actually make any impact, but in reality, we can. There are different organizations like climatechangemakers.org that lay out ways you can make an impact very easily if you decide to do it, rather than just get angry or frustrated or discouraged. And so the question is, will people pick up the baton and go, or stay on the sidelines? And I think that's a question for our era.
Yeah. Passion and advocacy is something that we all need to do for ourselves, regardless of what it is. Again, Barclay Palmer, it's been a true honor and privilege to have you on the program. And again, want to acknowledge you for the great work that you're doing in these important areas of our...
Privilege to talk with you. And I thank you for your work too.
Thank you so much. Look forward to sharing this episode and waking some people up a little bit.
Yes, and we'll make sure we include your contact information and organizations that you represent. And folks, reach out to Barclay, become involved. This is your country. We're all advocates in our own ways, children, our families. There are meaningful things to follow today and to become involved with. So we encourage you to do so. As Edward R. Murrow says at the end of every one of his broadcasts, good night and good luck, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.